podcast. I am Shannon, the Executive Director at Kentucky IEP Advocate. And today we're continuing our discussion about the consent to evaluate form. We just talked about the general intelligence testing with Robin last time. And now we have Rachel to talk about academic performance testing. Rachel is a former school psych examiner, and I will let you tell now what your former job is and what your current job is.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I used to, well, let me kind of go back a little bit. Shannon and I met in college, and during that time, I was getting my master's in special education, and I taught special education for 5 years. And I realized that was not really what I wanted to do at the time. So I went back to school and got a certification to be a school psych examiner here in Missouri, which is like a school psychologist. Essentially, I did testing for schools, basically completing the cognitive, academic, and behavioral portions of assessments and making eligibility determinations. So I did that honestly for the past, I think I was at year 13, 14. And this year I had an opportunity to move to a clinic and become their site manager for their new location. And this clinic's Come Play STL. And it is a really great place that offers play therapy, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, even just some parent counseling all in one location, so that everyone who is working together is able to communicate and make sure that the client that they're supporting is receiving all of the services that they need and everyone's on the same page. So that's something new and exciting. And occasionally I will still do assessments for outside for the clinic. But yeah, it's just a new opportunity that we're starting here soon. So that's it.
Exciting.
Yeah.
So today we are talking about the academic performance section on the consent to evaluate. The consent to evaluate is linked so that you can look at that. And this section that we're talking about is the top right corner and all of the boxes that could potentially have an X in them. What I want to talk about today is, in so many instances, it's a parent's responsibility to bring their concerns to a school district and provide justification for why testing needs to happen. So in those cases, when it's a parent's responsibility to specifically request these tests so that they get done, it's very important that a parent understands what all these areas are, because how would you know if you just say, I think my child has a skill deficit in reading? That's not going to get you very far, because you got a lot of reading options. So which one? More often than not, they're probably not going to be okay with checking all of them when you have to have these discussions about, like, what are the things that really concern you? And now we got to talk about how this impacts your access to education in the classroom. So what I'd like to talk about is, what do the skill deficits look like that would kind of give you a heads up as a parent to think, okay, so now I need to be really looking at this reading comprehension. I need to make sure that there's an X in the box for reading comprehension. So the first box in the academic performance is basic reading. Got any thoughts on basic reading?
Yeah. So that when we think about reading overall, those 3 areas are really just kind of your foundational piece for reading. So basic reading are those skills that you need to have in order to become a fluent reader who then can comprehend what you're reading. So this is integral to any child's just ability to begin reading. And when we're thinking about basic reading, it really just the assessments that we administer, a lot of the times what we're looking at is related to just their word reading ability, and it's looking at that in isolation. So not within that sentence component, they're able to read that sentence. We're looking at, can they look at a word and know what that word is? Do they recognize it? A lot of the times that's that sight word recognition that people talk about, where it's just these words that you see with frequency within passages or text and things like that. This basic reading is one where you can do it 2 different ways, because what we're looking at is just their word recognition. So just reading the words doesn't matter how long it takes them. We're looking at just, is that something that's fluent for them? Well, oftentimes you want them just to be able to read that word automatically, not to sit there and decode that. If they're decoding it, you can see that that is not something that is fluent for them, that they don't have just that word recognition automatically. And that for us is kind of one of those signs of like, this is a slow or a laborious process for them. So it is not something that is very strong. It's like, yes, they can read these words, but they're not doing it quickly. That then ties into that fluency part that we were talking about. But the other part, or the second component, is related to that decoding, those phonetic, the phonemic awareness, the phonics, those types of things. It's all kind of related to that. So the phonics piece, we're really looking at, can they decode words? And most of the times the words that we're assessing on are nonsense words or made up words, because we don't want them to have that recognition of like those sight words. We want to see if they come to a word that they don't know, what are their strategies that they use to figure this out? How do they come to a word and say, all right, can I chunk it into this part? Do I know what that blend says? Do I know what that diagraph says? Do they know the medial sounds? Oftentimes we're looking for a pattern within that to see, okay, most of the time they can get that beginning and that ending sound, or that final, or the beginning and the final sound, but that medial sound or the vowel sound, they just don't have that correct. We don't see, they get their vowels confused. It also allows us to see, do they transpose letters when they're doing this too? So it just kind of clues you into where are they struggling and what is that skill deficit that for them looks like. Yes, they can get certain CVC words, but they can't get those multisyllabic words. They're at the basic level, but they can't process beyond that. So it just gives us a really good idea of what that looks like before we get to the fluency, because that is something, once we get past basic reading, we also do timed assessments to see how quickly are they able to do that, because they might be able to perform in the average range just reading words or decoding words because there's no time limit set on them. But once we move into where, okay, how quickly can you read these words, or how quickly can you decode those words? That's where you see just a big difference between the two of like, they can't do it very automatically, which again starts to translate into that fluency part. The other part that we look at for basic reading is related to that phonemic awareness, that phonemic proficiency. And basically, that's essentially your understanding of how words or sounds go together. That looks at, in some assessments, that looks at rhyming, that works at like sound deletion. How can they look at a word, and if you substitute a sound within that word, can they make that new word? And you look at that a lot of times, if they can do like at the beginning of a word, they can substitute that. Do we look at, can they substitute the final? And can we look at that medial sound? So it really just gives you an idea of where are their strengths with their reading abilities and decoding abilities. And then how does that translate then to the next level of how in a paragraph does that look? Can they read those? Can they apply that to that next level? So that just kind of transitions then into that reading fluency part. But that basic reading is just, like I said, kind of in isolation. How are they able to do these skills, these kind of basic foundational pieces that you need to be able to be a fluent reader? So.
Well, and we'll talk about reading fluency, and the next thing to talk about is reading comprehension. So in order to discuss reading comprehension, in order to discuss reading fluency, you have to be able to read the words.
Yep.
So it is like, how do these letters have sounds? The sounds go together to make up words. How does that all go together so that you can read them?
Yep.
And then putting them together to make sense of a paragraph, which brings us to reading comprehension.
Yeah. So, and that's essentially reading comprehension is everything you were just saying. Can they take all of the words that they have just read on that page and make sense of them? Are they able to retain that whatever they just read and be able to answer various questions of one's right at that level where they can pick out that information from the text, or they have to kind of go above that where it's like maybe that answer could be within that passage, but you still have to apply some background knowledge, some contextual information, kind of what have you picked up from that, to even those higher level questions where you're inferencing about based on this story. Can you understand the nuances that then tell you, oh, I need to know that because this child was sad here, it's because, not because he didn't get the chocolate shake or something, it's because his dad has left for the week or something like that. And you able to pick up those types of things. And that comprehension part, it's really challenging for the most part. you have to look at that basic reading part, because if they don't have those basic reading skills, you're not going to get to that comprehension part. Or you have some kids who can just read through a passage, no problem, but as they're reading it, they're retaining nothing from it. So that is another key part. And like when I'm assessing and watching a student as they read this, most of the time they're reading it to themselves. So you don't always get to hear like what that sounds like when they're reading it. If they're able to get all of the words, most of the time the vocabulary becomes much more challenging as each passage goes along. And it's really just hard for that if you don't hear them reading to know like what is it that's kind of leading to the comprehension issue. But oftentimes when you see that, I'm looking at, are they using that text? Are they relying on that text to answer these questions? Or is there sometimes where they just remember it? And typically when I see kids who struggle with comprehension, they have to have me repeat the question. If they ask, they're looking for context clue within my own question to figure out what is it that I'm looking for within this passage. What other strategies or coping mechanisms have they picked up in order to try to comprehend? And then sometimes you just can see like their answers are so off, left field that you're like, all right, you weren't able to pick up on any of that. So then it's our job to kind of figure out what is that root cause of it. Is it more the comprehension part, or is it related maybe to more of just that word reading ability, that decoding piece that they just can't pick enough of that paragraph up to figure out, okay, here's what I'm looking for, how to answer that question. And kind of to tie into that too, if I think about comprehension, and let's say that this child reads honestly very well, is reading, words at within, there isn't we use a discrepancy model, so there isn't a gap between that. We can see that that word reading is strong, but that comprehension is low. I will also sometimes think to myself, is there something that's related to language too? Because that is something that when we think about the comprehension part of it, is there concerns with their receptive understanding? Is there concerns with that expressive understanding? Are the questions that I'm asking them, they just can't pick up what I'm asking? So there's a lot to consider for on my part of, if you're looking at that comprehension part too, there could just be questions related to language that you might also want to just kind of ask yourself, ask the teacher, do you see things that could potentially be related to that comprehension, and things that are a little bit more language dense assessment wise. If I do see that, that is just something that I want to make sure that we are also addressing, just to make sure that isn't part of the reason why they can't do the comprehension part. And sometimes also like even thinking about that like attention piece too. Just because when you have a child who potentially has an ADHD diagnosis or attention concerns in any capacity, there are times where they can't read that full paragraph or multi-paragraph and keep up with that. So you just have to think about all these other avenues that like could be the reason or the result of that as well. So I think with that comprehension part, just to, don't get yourself into that tunnel vision of it's only comprehension for reading. Just, making sure that there's other options that are also explored.
I think you made a really good point about the coping skills and coping mechanisms, the way kids can accommodate for themselves. So if you're evaluating an emerging reader, somebody who is developing reading skills, then you're looking at the development of those skills. If you're evaluating past third grade, I know in Kentucky that's kind of the benchmark of we have now taught you how to read. So you're no longer learning to read, you are now reading to learn. So
Yep.
you got the skills you got, and now you got to get moving with those skills. Great. We understand that process. Do we want to like push that off so they still have time for skill development? Probably, but that's where we're at, and that's how curriculum works. But also thinking if you have a fifth or a sixth grade kid, that kid has been in a classroom for how many years getting by.
Mhm.
So that kid knows I'm going to deflect and ask a different question. If you ask me, "Oh, what do you think?" I might say, "Oh, what do you think?" And that seems like a really good conversation, but really is it because they're like, "I'm not really sure what you read." So that becomes, kind of paying attention to those. They feel like a little bit nuanced. Also, we had a big discussion about classroom observations and why classroom observations are so important, because when you're connecting the dots to this objective data and then you want to have a good understanding of the negative impact on education, that's a really great opportunity to see that kid in class during English language arts and to be able to recognize like, oh, you just said a lot of things, but you didn't answer the question.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
you sure did say a lot, and it sounded pretty good if I don't think about the question that I asked you.
Mhm.
And I think those are some kids that like fall through the cracks or they're under the radar or whatever euphemism you're going to use. But like those are the kids sometimes that get missed because they're not the kids that are super quiet. It's almost like they overcompensate with this whole other conversational piece
Yep.
because they don't know how to answer the question. So rather than saying, I have no idea what I just read and how I should answer that, I I'm just going to derail this conversation over here into this thing and now we're all talking about something else.
Yep.
So
Absolutely. And that's, I want to say comprehension is one of those, it's hard to pinpoint that, like when you're looking at it, it is hard to really say yes, that comprehension is what's impacting their performance across the board. Like it's hard because you think about comprehension, that is in every area. It doesn't have to just be in reading, because reading, you're going to see that in social studies, you're going to see that in science, and those are just those language dense subjects.
mhm.
And it is one where it's like, if you see that happening, even like math, you're looking at word problems, like that comprehension part, you're going to miss that. So it's like, yeah, it looks like he's struggling in math, but in fact, the child is really just struggling with the comprehension part. So how do you accommodate, how do you help that child? It's not necessarily that they're unable to do math, it's the fact that they don't know what the problem is even saying and how to break that down. So I would say that is one of those areas that I think is really challenging to really kind of figure out what is it specifically that they're struggling with, that comprehension part. But
Well,
you're absolutely
all
right.
the more all the more reason to not make an educational decision based on one piece of data. That's why you collect lots and why you look for patterns to make sure
Yeah.
that you're not making, if this is an outlier or this is the only thing that you're looking at, you're not going to be able to see how these things all work together.
Yeah.
One thing I can't let go, but we're not going to talk about today in depth is native language. And when you start talking about those cultural differences and the way language works in different languages, it's
Mhm.
very redundant, but the way different languages work with words and language, that also can impact. So I know that we were talking earlier, you're doing these tests, you're doing these tests that are not likely normed and referenced on the kids that you're doing them on. So
Yeah.
there is a like, use these results with caution, be mindful of, but that's something to be mindful of. And that is a whole other discussion to have for a different day. But when we're talking language, I feel like it's important.
Well, I'm just
Um,
really quickly while you're saying that, like with
yeah.
that language part, even just like the experiences that I have, the school that I previously worked in, we had a lot of Spanish speaking, Vietnamese. Those were really, and even Arabic, those were really big ones that when testing, those are usually when we bring interpreters in. And even when you're using an interpreter, they will note, there are things that you're saying that don't translate into our language. And it's like, well, how are we then how are we then sure that this is really what we're assessing? This is an accurate score. And I think that is really just like you said, that's a whole another episode on that, because it is something where you don't want to over identify, but you also don't want to under identify. And it is hard to, as in this profession, really figure out, is this a true language concern? Is this an academic concern? It's a fine line that you tread very carefully, because you don't want to label somebody or misidentify somebody and have them stuck into this setting that they are never able to progress, or they continue to fall behind. And that's a hard
Lots of considerations.
one. Yeah, that's a trick.
Okay, so the last reading component is
Mhm.
reading fluency. And this is, we were talking before, this is something that I feel like I get a lot of questions about because parents just don't even know what fluency is, but they're describing all of the things that are
Mhm.
disfluencies.
Yeah.
And talk about that being a language component because down here in the communication status, there's also a fluency. So lots of overlap.
Okay, amazing. Um, and
Mhm.
just thinking about that fluency for us, what we're asking students to do when we do an assessment is really just listening to them read. There are, a lot of assessments that teachers can do, and they're called running records. And essentially, you're looking at the rate at which they are able to read, their accuracy while they're reading. But you're also just noting for them, are they paying attention to punctuation? How is their voice? How is that intonation? Do they just read through it just to read through it and not really have that natural flow when you're reading? So then their rate looks beautiful, but they might make a lot of errors and not self-correct those. You're looking at, are they aware of when they make a mistake? Are they picking up on that? A lot of the time when we're seeing kind of those beginning levels or kids who are struggling with more of that reading fluency, what we're noting is, again, relates to a lot of what you see with that basic reading. So that automaticity, when they are reading these passages, are they stopping at every word, trying to figure out what each word is? Are they decoding every single word? You are really just trying to see, you want it to sound like a natural conversation when you're having, you want that just flow when you're reading. And for some students, it's where they have those breaks in between and it's just very choppy, or it's word by word. If you have a kid who is reading, I like the cat, that is not fluent. That is, they're still just kind of at that point where you are listening for it. You want it to just kind of layer. I always think about it. You want to run your finger under each word, and it's just your finger is following and tracking that, and it sounds kind of that pace of what you have. So it really relates to having that strong basic reading foundation and just really being able to read words smoothly and accurately. And then if you come to a word you don't know, being able to use your strategies to come up with that word, to decode that word. And then also a little part of that fluency you check then after it is to see, how's their comprehension related to that? Were they then able to glean any information, or are they working so hard to read that paragraph that they've missed out on anything, even just kind of your basic level question? And so that is, I think, really important with that fluency piece. It's not just the fluency, but it's then, if that is such a slow, laborious piece that they've gathered, they have not retained any of that information. It's maybe not necessarily the comprehension piece. It's just showing you that that fluency is not to the point where they can also, like you were saying, kind of that read to learn. And so getting to that point, they're going to really struggle to retain all of that information. So a lot of that fluency comes into play, even just thinking about kind of like their phonological loop, what they are able to remember. So just being able to do that, is going to be really important too, because that relates to even thinking about, like, for the beginning kids, or even just kids who struggle with reading, you sometimes will administer like a phonological assessment that looks at their rapid symbolic naming, or just how quickly are they able to associate something. So sometimes they have to name pictures as quickly as they can. Sometimes you will assess how quickly they can say letters or numbers. And so you can see how quickly are they able to take in visual information and read it back to you. Essentially, are they able to do that with ease, or is that a really hard task for them? And if that's something that slows them down, that fluency is definitely going to be impacted. And that's where we talk about a little bit of orthographic fluency and just their decoding fluency too. And again, that ties into all those basic reading skills. And if they can't do it quickly or automatically, then that they're probably going to be missing out on a lot of the information that they're attempting to read. So
it seems like, if we're talking best practice in assessment, we're talking about a robust evaluation when you're looking at concerns with reading. If you have a concern with fluency or comprehension, you absolutely better be looking at basic reading skills
without question,
to make sure that they have the foundation to do that.
Yeah, because honestly, if you don't have those, it's going to be so hard to progress make progress with those other areas. I mean, that's what you start with. You really just need to know your letters, the letter sounds, what you do with those, how those work together to make all these different sounds. I mean, there's so much to that if you don't have a good foundational piece in all of those, you're going to struggle with reading, like, unless you just naturally are a good reader and pick up on that. But I mean, if you don't have those, you just are destined to that's just going to be hard.
Well, and then I think the flip side of that too is, so sure, looking at comprehension and fluency without looking at basic reading doesn't make much sense, because we want to know that you have the foundation. But looking at only basic reading doesn't even tell us what you're doing with that information.
Oh.
So the comprehension, the fluency are so important to do.
Oh, absolutely.
It's kind of bringing us to like You got any reading concerns at all?
I just put them all together.
We're talking about a comprehensive evaluation
Yeah.
that covers all your bases to determine. And one thing too we've talked about with other professionals is when you're doing assessments, it isn't always because you know that there's a skill deficit. So, sure, we're collecting data to make sure that we have enough data that says, oh, this is questionable enough. But we're not already deciding that you have a specific learning disability in reading before we do the reading testing to confirm what we've already looked at. So, sure, maybe you don't necessarily have a lot of fluency and comprehension concerns at the moment, but because of how close these three things work together, it doesn't make sense if you're going to do a robust evaluation to not do all three of those tests.
And that's well, we talk about good practice. I think
Hmm.
for me personally, it is one where I know it varies from professional to professional, state to state. I get that. But it is one where you suspect that's what you're looking at. You suspect that there could be some reading disability, whether or not they're going to meet eligibility. You can't go in with a mindset of like, there's no question this kid has a reading fluency learning disability. You have to go in and say, I suspect that this is the case. Here's all my evidence to support that final decision. And that is what the comprehensive evaluation should be looking at is how am I proving to whomever, the parent, the teacher, the DESE for Missouri, how did I prove to them that this child is eligible? Here's all my evidence. I have given all the assessments and I do not just one test, I will do multiple tests because you have to say it's not just one day that I'm able to, or this assessment that I am able to say, yes, without certainty, this child has learning disability. If they have one day where they are really on, and then the next day it's like, whoa, no, that was your scores are completely different. I'm going to say, why is that? I need to say, then justify what could be that difference between those different assessments. And maybe I need to do an informal assessment with them, something to say, okay, here's another piece of information that I have to say, here's what I saw on the first day matches more of what I saw a week later, in the kind of same environment. But you're also doing an observation in whatever reading classroom that they have so you can see what does that look like when you're actually applying the skill, not just on an assessment but in a real world situation in the classroom. What does that actually look like? And those are all of those pieces that you really have to say, here's what I am showing you, here's how I came up with that decision. And that's usually, when you're discussing that the final eligibility meeting, you're going over all this and in depth and talking about that with the parents so they fully understand that it wasn't just this one assessment that then said, well, that's it. They have either met or did not meet eligibility. And you have to explain that to them so well. So anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. Why we don't make decisions based on one piece of data.
Yep.
So that's important. It's good to know that you're able to identify and see a pattern. And then also connect that back to how does this negatively impact your access to education? You're gonna be hard pressed to find a time when reading isn't necessary,
Oh,
for sure.
across the board,
Yeah.
everything that you do, is going to have some component of reading, whatever that looks like, varies, but it doesn't matter. It'll be your whole career.
Well, not planned, but what we're gonna do is time out here and finish this one today because we are at pushing 30 minutes
Oh my
on
gosh, I'm sorry.
reading
I'm such a
assessments.
talker.
No, that's so also something that I have talked about with other people is that yes, this feels like a lot. And yes, this is a lot of information about assessments, but also it's because all of these assessments are going to determine what level of intervention, what type of intervention, what are the goals, what are we looking at. So it's really important that you have a good understanding of the assessments that are available and why you may choose them. And
Mhm.
when you already have these little indicators that are like, I think my kid needs more help, I think they need to be assessed, I think if you're the one getting that ball rolling, then sometimes you also have to be the one that says, I need to do the full battery of reading tests, or you need to do the full battery of reading tests. And then it's the professional's job to determine what that looks like and how those things work together. But it is a lot, but it's also a lot because you're not going to get through your school day without reading.
Yeah.
You're just not. And we can provide reasonable accommodations and we can support a reader as much as we can, but also that doesn't mean that you don't get a chance to learn how to read.
Mhm.
It's going to be my mic drop for today. And we will circle back together to talk about the remaining tests that are in the academic performance, just so we're not overwhelming everybody with one.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today, and we'll be back next time to talk about the